Welcome to Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm here with Larry Kotlikoff and Uri Dadush, and we're here to talk about the end of world trade, ? Is it over? We'll find out, I guess. Maybe, Larry, you want to start by introducing our guest?
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here with everybody today. Uri Dadush is one of the world's leading experts on international trade. He's currently a research professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He's a non-resident scholar at Bruegel and at the Policy Center for the New South. He's based in Washington, D.C., and is principal of Economic Policy International, LLC, that provides consulting services to the World Bank and other international organizations. Now, before he took on all these assignments, he was director of the International Economics Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But before that, he had a long stint with the World Bank as director of international trade, economic policy, and development policy prospects of those departments at the World Bank. He was basically the top guy at the World Bank for decades on international trade. And then before that, he was president of the Economists Intelligence Unit. So we're talking about the same organization that puts out the Economist magazine. And he was group vice president of data. So he was working for the Economists in their business intelligence, economics intelligence unit for many years. And then before that, he was working at Data Resources, Inc. as a group vice president. And then before that, he was a consultant at McKinsey and Company. Now, what does not appear on his vita here, and I think this might be my first question for him, is his association with me, because it doesn't say fellow grad student with Larry Kotlikoff. Uri has a PhD in economics from Harvard Business Economics, and we were in grad school together. Indeed, I met Uri on the very first day I started grad school. I was there completely terrified in the lobby, no idea where to go. We had I think our first class was somewhere in this building, and I was looking at the board to try and figure out where to go. And then Uri comes up and says, "You wouldn't happen to be in the same program as me?" I said, "What program?" And he tells me, and I said, "Yeah, we're in the same program." And he says, "Well, I'm lost." And I said, "Well, come with me." So I've been trying to guide him ever since. But I think the reality is that he's been guiding me more than I've been guiding him. Now, we actually spent a lot of time talking economics, and we are very close buddies. And he knows a hell of a lot about economics in general, but about international economics. And we're now sitting in a situation where we have the prospects for world trade to devolve, to boil, to basically, fall apart. And we're seeing this in the context of Russia. We're having Russia. We in the West are trying to turn Russia into Iran from the perspective of international trade. And there's some people that want to do the same thing with China, especially if China, let's say, follows its ambition to take over Taiwan. So the big question I want to start you with, Uri, is do you see this as a major concern that we could, I think we can live in the world without Russia, without trading with Russia. It'll take major adjustments as we're seeing, but it's not so clear for the U.S. that we can do that with China. And I want to get your reaction to what could happen, the worst case scenario, and then we'll talk about what you think is the likely scenario.
Right. Yeah, Larry. Well, first of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this and with you, old friend. And you start with the toughest question, the relationship with China. Well, as you said, trade with China, between the United States and China is much more important than trade with Russia, or indeed likely with any other country. And I'm not just focusing on the quantity of trade, which is very substantial, and goes deep because many American companies rely on imports from China for parts and components, many of which are now liable to pay a 20% tariff. And because many American companies are basing their business plans and long term strategies on exports and sales to China. And that includes very important multinational companies that have vital production operations in China. So even when they are not exporting from the United States, they are very dependent on the Chinese market for a large part of their profits. Okay, I'm referring to Apple, for example, or Nike, just to take a couple of examples. But that's really not the whole story of trade with China, because China is now the world's largest trading nation in goods. The United States is number two. United States is still number one in trade in services. China, I think, is number two or number three in trade in services. And China remains one of the world's fastest growing economies, despite the recent slowdown. So the central message here is that China and the United States are married. And it's an unhappy marriage, but they are married. And it's going to be very, very difficult to break up that marriage. And trying to break up that marriage by isolating oneself from trade will have huge repercussions in all other areas, beginning with security, but also have disastrous effect on the ability of China and the United States to collaborate on any number of issues that we're referring here to the global commons, whether we're talking about climate change or macroeconomic stability of the world, collaborating through the IMF and other organizations. So trade with China itself is tremendously important, but the way that it affects the overall relationship between the two superpowers is even more important from the perspective of global stability and growth.
And by the way, I forgot to introduce Alex. Alex is my son, and he's works with me in our company that produces our financial planning software tool called Maxify Planner at maxify.com. And he works on a variety of different parts of the company and is helping me put on this podcast, Economics Matters. We're doing newsletters. I'm writing newsletters. I may co-author some with him over time, but also he's doing the audio version of those. And then we started this video podcast, and Uri's our second guest. So, Alex, pipe in whenever you have a question. I guess my question would be, China's pumping out new naval ships. I think their Navy now is physically larger in terms of number of ships than the U.S. Navy. We have more aircraft carriers, although it's not clear that they're of any value when you have hypersonic missiles. Do you think that Taiwan is likely to be invaded by China, and what would happen if it were? I mean, as you were saying, China is now a bigger, or you're suggesting, let me say it, that China is a bigger, on some measures, economy than the U.S. right now. It's the world's largest economy, about arguably 18% of world GDP. We're about 16%. And if you look at studies, and I've got one coming out with some co-authors, actually Russian co-authors in part, uh, China by the end of the century will have about 26%, about more than a quarter of world output. Uh, and even though its population is going to shrink quite dramatically by about 400 million, which is bigger than the current U.S. population because of their one child policy, which has kind of reverberates through time in terms of how many kids those kids can have. So, and then India is going to have about 12% of the world's GDP. So now you've got those two countries, and it could be even much higher share of those two countries if they grow more rapidly in terms of output per worker. And the U.S. and Europe will be kind of second. They'll have about 11%, 10% of output each. So we're going to kind of flip positions, more than flip positions, with the U.S. and Europe versus China and India. And so if we got into a prolonged trade war with China to try to isolate them, and they're growing rapidly and they become the world economy in effect, we could lose in that argument. But anyway, give us your view, and Alex, you pipe in with your view. Oh, Alex, can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah, let me pipe in for. I think I accidentally muted Uri here, so he just needs to hit the mic icon. Apologies for that. Oh,
Yeah,
there
no
you are.
problem.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I have a question after that, but then I'll ask.
Okay, all right, yeah. So on Taiwan, uh, my view is that at some point this issue is going to come to a head, very simply because the Chinese view this as a fundamental question of sovereignty, the resolution of a civil war that that occurred at the time of many years ago during the World War II, effectively or immediately after, and that has not been resolved because the rebels then, as they see them, as the government of China sees it today, because the rebels took refuge in Taiwan. And so for the Chinese, the reunification of China, as they see it, is a fundamental objective. It has been so for a very long time, continues to be so today. And by the way, the United States and many other countries adhere to the one China policy, meaning that officially the United States recognizes, as part of its rapprochement to China, which goes back to Nixon and Kissinger's in the mid-70s, recognizes that China is one country and that Taiwan should be part of China. Okay, so the actual argument, technically at least, is how this happens. The United States is opposed to reunification by force, as are many of American allies. So this is an issue that's there, it's been there for a long time, and at some point it will come to a head. I do not believe, you know, I don't know, of course, I'm not in the head of the Chinese policymakers, but I do not believe that action of that kind is imminent. I think that what is happening on the Russia-Ukraine front and the reaction of NATO and its ally and America's allies presents a major warning to China about what the consequences of doing that might be. And so I don't expect something imminent. But as you said, Larry, history is working so far in the direction of the Chinese. And Chinese economic power, and by reflection, military power, is growing all the time. And repeated war games that are being carried out in the Pentagon, the White House, etc., suggest that even today, should the Chinese decide to stage an all-out attack on Taiwan, it'll be very, very difficult to resist that. Which, of course, as I said, does not mean that the cost for China would be gigantic, as seen in the Russian case. So that's my best assessment of Taiwan. And the sad thing is that unless this issue is resolved in some way, and there are, one can imagine all sorts of compromises of ways that this reunification can take place over a long period of time and in a peaceful way, etc. And the Chinese have a very long decision horizon. And so one could imagine agreements where, over 100 years, there is a gradual reunification of the two countries, etc.,
So they
etc.
could lease Taiwan to the Taiwanese government for 100 years, and
Or something, or something like that. Of course, what has happened in Hong Kong recently kind of makes it more difficult to go that route. But somehow, at some time, this issue will need to be resolved, or it will come to a head, and it could lead to outright war. It could lead to outright war. I think it's unlikely. I think it's more likely that when and if when it happens, if there should be military action, then you're going to see the unfolding of a scenario similar to that of the Russia-Ukraine situation, which, as I said in my answer to your first question, would be extremely costly, not only for China, but also for the United States.
U.S. might end up being the major loser of that because the rest of the world might end up not going along, because China's just too important economically speaking to boycott. Alex, hop in here.
Well, I sort of along those lines. I guess two questions. One is I think that a lot of people, I agree with the idea that the U.S. and China are in a marriage, and it's an unhealthy marriage. I think a lot of Americans don't know that we're in a marriage, and we, we hear a lot of talk about competition with China, and from politicians all the time. But maybe you want to talk about, I guess the first question is, what is the history of how we came to be married to China? How did we get engaged? And how is it that we're intertwined? And I guess the second question I have is what are the impacts that you see going forward with the Belt and Road Initiative that's started under Xi, which seems to be a tremendous initiative geopolitically, but also economically.
So the way that the United States and China became married goes back to the middle 1970s, when there was the opening to China, engineered by Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and Richard Nixon, President. And the opening to China was motivated not by economics at the time, although economics might have played a role, but by big power competition. The objective was to split China from the Soviet Union and to effect a major change in the balance of power. And there were some issues big issues between China and the Soviet Union, etc., etc. And the Chinese decided that this was the best path to take to kind of have an equidistant relationship, a three-way equidistant relationship at the start. But then what happened is that American firms saw opportunities in China, the huge population, etc. But at first, I think the economic relationship was quite, tenuous, and there wasn't that much going on. But then what happened is that China itself embarked on a major shift, beginning sort of in the 80s, towards the end of the 80s, the second half of the 80s, under Deng Xiaoping, and basically did a major reorientation, as they saw it, towards the market economy. And this was a very complex process. We don't have time to discuss it here, but the net result was that China started knocking at the door of world markets and tried very, very hard after it did a number of domestic reforms, including beginning in agriculture, tried very hard and with big success to attract foreign direct investment. And American companies were among the first to become engaged in that. And they found in China not only a huge market, but a willing, very low-cost labor force. And quickly they realized that they could also find pretty skilled people in China, even though the level of education, the level of income was much lower. The Chinese just seemed to be catching up very, very quickly in terms of technological capacity, ability to manage complex situations, et cetera, et cetera. And the macro environment was very favorable to American companies. It was quite stable and very welcoming. The next phase came with the accession of China to the World Trade Organization, which happened in 2001 at Doha. I was actually there representing the World Bank, heading the World Bank delegation. And this was a game changer. The rising importance of China was already very evident in the 10 years prior to their accession in the WTO. But what accession in the WTO did is it effectively...
That's the World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization had effectively ensured that China had secure access to the United States market. Instead of what's called MFN treatment, most favored nation treatment, for China having to be renewed every year after debates at the Congress. And that period, beginning in the in the 1990s, and then extending all the way to, I would say, 2007 and 8, saw a spectacular surge of Chinese exports to the United States in a large swath of sectors. And by the way, the materialization or the occurrence of a very large current account surplus of China vis-a-vis the United States, or deficit of the United States,
meaning they
vis-a-vis
were
China.
Just to translation, that would mean that they're investing abroad more than their investment exceeds their saving, and that extra investment that they're not investing at home is being invested abroad. That's really the current.
Yeah, so part of what was happening was that that current account surplus that China was running became the wherewithal for China to buy a lot of U.S. Treasury securities and accumulate reserves. And when you accumulate reserves at that time, or these days even, you will naturally turn to U.S. Treasuries. That's the prime asset for international reserves. So then the United States and China became married through trade, particularly the dependence of the United States on Chinese imports, a little bit of exports from the United States to China, very large foreign investment and dependence of American companies on the Chinese market through production in China mainly, and some production in third countries. And United States borrowing from China, because that's what it is when the Chinese buy U.S. Treasury securities to finance their overall current account deficit. And this mutual dependence in economic terms has continued and even increased in some respects, even after President Trump initiated the Section 301 tariffs on China. And President Biden has not changed that policy yet, although he's been talking about changing a bit of it. So the mutual economic dependence is very, very much alive today.
Yeah, I think maybe we could shift. We've been talking about the long run. What will happen with Taiwan? Will we try and transform if that happens? If China invades Taiwan, will we try and, with our allies, boycott China economically? Is that really viable when China is already a bigger economy than we are, and when our allies might not come along, especially if this happens in 10 or 20 or 30 years when they're that much bigger? So there's that question, but then the other question. So that's the bigger long run concern. But then the short run, I think, interesting question that some of your writings is speaking to is, we had Trump come into office and decide that he wanted to brand China as the latest Satan, the great Satan when it comes to trade, and that they were stealing from us and engaging in intellectual property theft, and of course a lot of that may be true, but then he puts on these tariffs on steel and aluminum and soybeans. I guess they put on tariffs on soybeans. But when you look at the data, several years later, after, for example, the steel tariffs were put on, there's a short run impact of additional steel production in the U.S. We're now actually producing less steel than before, right before these tariffs were put into place. Steel production's gone down, aluminum production's gone down in the U.S. Soybean production is kind of back where it was. It dropped for a bit. So, and as you've written, Uri, these are kind of, if you put together all the impacts of the things that have been subject to tariff on the U.S. economy, there's really a drop in the bucket. You said it's like 0.02%. So it's two one hundredths of 1% of GDP in terms of its impact, if I recall the number correctly. So it seems like this entire trade war with China was just political theater and not for real, and that we're maintaining that theater. But of course, these kinds of theatrics can get you into trouble. They can lead to nationalism on the other side, and then some politician on the other side says the U.S. has made us into its enemy, so we're their enemy. So let's go and take over Taiwan now because they're occupied in the Ukraine.
Right.
Am I correctly summarizing your views on this?
Yeah, I would call it more than political theater, but broadly the message is correct. Um, it's very interesting. Economists estimate that using, I look at carefully at what they do on. I don't do the modeling myself, but I look at it carefully. Um, Modelers estimate that the tariffs on the Chinese cost American consumers every year 50 to 60 billion dollars. Okay, that's certainly not a trivial sum, right? You could do a lot of good things with 50, 60 billion dollars. Um, but at the same time, if you compare it to the size of U.S. consumption or U.S. consumer incomes, etc., it is, as you said, Larry, a very small amount. Now, these numbers can be very misleading because even though I'm not challenging the number, they're very misleading because then you have specific instances of people who importers from China, small family businesses, or even larger corporations that depend on imports for China, which suffer a huge loss. And I know some of these people personally. Some of them are children of my friends, et cetera, basically have to leave their import activity or their production activity, etc., because of these tariffs. So they have a very serious effect on many people, and of course on many exporters, on many Chinese exporters. And the Chinese have, of course, retaliated. And that has had a significant effect, at least for a while, on American farmers, and so on and so forth. But then when you kind of widen the lens and look at it in broad economic terms, you come up with relatively small numbers. And not much is being achieved
So
by
this
these
idea, I
tariffs.
mean, there's this underlying idea that's, I think, around these days that we can become self-dependent. That this kind of this tend towards isolationism uh, that's out there, that we can produce our own steel, our own aluminum, our own cars, or our own chips, our own everything. Uh, I think that's kind of folly. And it's
Yeah,
interesting that you pointed out that the tariffs on China were actually larger than the tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that we put on against Europe in in the Great Depression,
yeah,
in
the
terms
increase
of
is, yes,
the
yes.
magnitude. So
But broadly,
this was across the board. Was
yeah,
it an across the board 20% tariff on on all Chinese goods?
almost large part, something like
Large parts.
60, 70% of U.S. imports from China
So if you do that,
are
yeah.
covered. Yeah,
So if you do
but
that,
their effect is, as you pointed out, mainly borne by consumers. Uh, the expected reaction of the Chinese, which had been that they would accelerate their structural reforms, deal with some of the complaints that the Americans have been essentially dashed, including the promise that the Chinese made that they would increase imports from the United States. They are not meeting those targets. Not surprisingly, in my view, because they never really wanted to do it. They saw themselves being forced into it. And this is a huge country, proud.
so
So yeah, and so as I tried to explain in the article you're referring to, I read there is protectionism, a protectionist motive in the tariffs on China. But whatever protectionist motive there was initially has really been lost in translation, so to speak, because this is what is happening now is it's a big geopolitical fight. between China and the United States, of which the tariffs are only actually one part. And while a highly visible part, it is not necessarily the most important. The more important competition that is going on is, what's happening on the military balance of power in the South China Sea, what is happening on technological competition, and what's Chinese policies, foreign policies in all sorts of areas, including the one you mentioned, Alex, the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. So it's about competition in Africa. It's about, above all, competition in Asia for influence. So this is part now of a much bigger picture. And I like to stress that even if we do get a compromise on the tariffs, this is by no means the end of the game. It's the game that is being played now is a much larger game, and one that will be going on for perhaps long after we have forgotten about the tariff war.
I have a question that goes with what you just described. You mentioned at the beginning that the U.S. and China, have to work together since they're economically intertwined and the two largest economies in the world to solve the major issues of today. Where do you see China going in terms of climate change and their policies around climate, considering where the U.S. is currently in terms of no congressional action? Do you think the Chinese will work unilaterally towards their climate goals, or do they feel like they'll only go along if the U.S. acts?
Boy, that's a tough question. I think the Chinese are very aware of the climate problem, as are, by the way, many experts and senior politicians in the United States. Both there is broad consensus and understanding across many decision makers in the United States and the Chinese leadership that climate change is a huge problem that needs to be tackled. And in terms of action, it is absolutely crucial that China participate in this effort because they are now the largest emitter. Okay, not surprisingly, because they have a 1.4 billion population, yeah, about 4 times that of the United States, and they have a much bigger manufacturing sector, and they're also building up infrastructure, which have been building up infrastructure for a while. China, it needs to be stressed. Many people don't understand this or don't want to understand it. Is a much poorer economy than the United States. It is a huge economy. It is a bigger economy than the United States, but it is a poorer economy with average incomes per capita or wages in China in real terms, in terms of purchasing power, that are about 1/3 that of the United States, 1/3 to 1/4. And there's an interesting statistic that many people don't know, which is actually the absolute gap between American living standards and Chinese living standards. The absolute gap, not the relative gap, has actually been widening since about 2010, very simply because even though China has a higher growth rate, they're coming off a much lower base. And so Americans are adding more income every year than the Chinese are. So the fact that China is a relatively poor economy has all sorts of implications. For example, it's more expensive for them in relative terms to decarbonize. They have very large reserves of coal, etc., which is a relatively cheap and much cheaper source of energy than many others for them. They do not have the same availability of natural gas. They have to import natural gas, and they import huge amounts of oil as well, while the United States has become effectively energy sufficient because of its large reserves of natural gas and oil as well. So it's very expensive for the Chinese to decarbonize. And they are also, because they're relatively poor, they're very early in the, let's say, consumer transition towards energy intensive consumption. I mean, China is now by far the fastest growing car market in the world in absolute terms. And the Chinese, like the Americans, as they become wealthier, want to have, air conditioning, for example, and so on and so forth. So the pressures on China, the economic pressures on China, which are implicit in the decarbonization process, are just as important or more important than they are in the United States. Nevertheless, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in these areas. The consensus, the professional consensus, is that the Chinese have been serious about climate change, and they're taking serious steps to achieve their target, which is net zero, I believe, that by 2060, if I remember correctly, not 2050, as many advanced countries are. And China is now the largest producer of equipment and also, I believe, green energy itself.
Solar panels.
Solar,
Yes.
particularly solar and wind, etc. So they are moving in the right direction. And obviously, they will have their eye on the United States, and not only on the United States, on other countries of the world, because it's a common problem. And even if China does their bit, but the United States does not do its bit, or Europe does not do its bit, which is less likely, by the way, the Europeans are quite serious about this. Then China's efforts will be much less effective than they would be. So it's the usual coordination game here, major coordination game, which is going on. And if we are, in a cold war with China, that coordination will be much more difficult.
I think maybe we should bring this to an end with close with some upbeat discussion or considerations. In some of your writings, Uri, you mentioned the fact that in lots of areas of international negotiations on trade, that China has actually been playing a good positive role. To my surprise, and that it has been taking some steps, maybe not openly, but or as publicly as we would like, to accommodate some concerns that we have. For example, that U.S. companies that invest in China have to jointly invest with Chinese partners, things of that nature. Can we hope that China, or maybe what we should be doing at the top, is encouraging China to understand that it's going to be, or it is, the world's leading economic power. If the U.S. were to come out and say, "Look, you are the big dog on the block here. You're already there, and you're going to be increasingly so. So it's your responsibility to act like the grown up, to act like the father of the world, and to take on these responsibilities in so many different areas, including human rights and military restraint, to guide the world with respect to climate." I think if that message were conveyed from our government to their government publicly uh, if President Biden were to say this, because it's accepting the reality of this. This is happening in front of our eyes. You go to Shanghai, you see skyscrapers that you wouldn't believe, things that we don't have in our country. Look at the brand new airport in Beijing that was featured in I guess, their Olympics. I mean, there's some amazing things that are happening in China in real time. So I think we have to understand in our country that we are heading to uh, second status, second level B League status when it comes to economic power, and that we need to understand it and accept it and embrace it, and do that by challenging China to take over the role that we've been playing for our period of economic hegemony, and guide the world in this manner. I think that message would actually be a lot more productive than calling China, in effect, the evil empire or the next evil empire. But let me get your quick reaction and Alex's quick reaction to that, and then we'll give it a call it a day.
Well, I agree with your overall message, Larry. I don't think, by the way, the United States should have an inferiority complex vis-a-vis China. It is the United States remains, as I said, by far a richer economy, more productive economy, huge innovation capacity. I happen to be very optimistic about the long-term prospects for the United States. The United States economy, and China may be going faster, but and I'm an old man, but if you ask me 20 years from now, would I prefer to be in China or the United States? I would say to you, I much prefer to be in the United States, not only for economic reasons, but because for better or worse, we have a democracy in this country that's not working particularly well, but we do. And but your central message is correct, and there is a major shift ongoing in the economic and therefore in the political balance of power of the world. And this is not the first time it happens. Harvard professor Graham Allison wrote a beautiful book on the China-US relationship called Destined for War, which looks into and uses several examples of what happens in history when you have a rising power challenging a hegemon. And most of the time, that doesn't work out well. And a lot depends on how the rising power does its thing and how the hegemon manages and reacts. And there are all sorts of ways that you can accommodate this intrinsically difficult conflict and manage it. But it has to be done with great wisdom. And one of the worries, and I'll just stop there, the biggest worry, in my view, in managing this transition, this historic transition, is when policymakers, instead of thinking about international relations and how to manage them, are playing to a domestic audience, whether it is, and to the prejudice of a domestic audience, whether we're talking about China and the Communist Party and its need to keep its troops lined up, or we're talking in the United States, where bashing China has become now definitely a political winner. And that's a very dangerous situation. And that's why we always, always need what's called statesmanship or stateswomanship, whatever you want to call it, which is the capacity to look at the big picture, to look outside your window, and to think about how we can get a very, very complex global picture to work out rather than looking inside the house all the time and trying to respond to the latest political whims.
Great. Alex, you have any closing comments? Thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would echo that. I mean, I think that China bashing has definitely become bipartisan at this point. I mean, you can kind of see that in the Biden administration. And I think what people need to remember is that China is like us, a nuclear power. They don't have as many nuclear weapons as we do, but a actual hot war with China means game over. And the question is going to be whether the U.S. Can, and I think China hawks, and particularly sort of conservatives in the U.S. are going to be tolerant of China's rise and work proactively with China in the future, or not, and get us into something that's really something that's actually mutually destructive for everyone. You know, China's not going to go away, and it's it's here to stay. Clearly,
So we need some good marriage counseling. Is this the bottom line?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who's going to give it? You
Yeah.
give it, Larry.
Okay. We'll give it a try. Okay. So thank you so much, Yuri. The big problem with this podcast was that we agreed on too many things as usual.
Yeah.
But going to see you this weekend. So I'm excited about that. And Alex, thanks for leading us as ever. Okay. We'll see you
sounds
guys.
good.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye, guys.